can do more, and I think there is scope for an improvement in that area. In relation to the issue of governance generally and good governance, European Union development programmes and indeed the development programmes of member states do seek as an integrated part of those programmes to combat corruption, to build better financial accountability, to build better scrutiny, to work with the parliaments of African states in building up that capacity, and I think that has to remain part of the development strategies that we have in Europe. The issue raised by two issues raised by Mr. Borbeli. First of all, the issue of the European security strategy. That strategy coming from 2003, that is still valid. There are, of course, issues that have to remain under constant review, and proposals to update that strategy will form part of the European Council discussion on defence issues, which is scheduled for December. In relation to the issue, the Moldova Transnistria issue, as a country, we worked hard in our capacity as chair of the OSCE last year to get progress in the 5+2 talks. We did get agreement in those talks on principles and procedures. We hope that the Ukrainian chairmanship of the OSCE can now take that forward. And I do indeed agree that there are potential difficulties because of political instability in Moldova. The issues raised by Sean Crowe, I think in relation to the issue of coordination and where fits the military dimension, the political dimension, the economic dimension, the development dimension. I think that what is important here is that the European Union develops a comprehensive approach to the work that it is doing in promoting peace and the settlement of conflicts. I do agree, however, that there needs to be a careful differentiation between the political and military responses to individual crisis situations, and I think that needs to be looked at on a crisis by crisis basis. I don't think there is a one size fits all approach in relation to that differentiation. On the issue of settlements, it is very worrying that there are planned settlements that are intended to proceed, and it would appear within a short period of time, particularly the settlements in the E1 area. Those settlements, if they do proceed, will physically make a two-state solution virtually impossible because of the geography of the settlements. On the issue of the labelling and the treatment of products from settlement areas, the European Union is now looking at ways of identifying more clearly the origin of settlement products. Some member states have put in place on a voluntary basis some administrative arrangements, but what is now being looked at is a European-wide, and the High Representative has recently written to each of the foreign ministers of the member states, setting out some guidelines about how there could be a European Union-wide approach taken to settlement products.
Okay, thank you very much, Tánaiste. We'll now move on to our next slot, and the first speaker here is Ms. Gomez from the European Parliament.
Thank you, Minister. Very pleased to hear you. I'm one of the people who takes the Nobel Prize not in a self-congratulatory mode, but actually has an incentive for us to do more in foreign policy, but actually also to preserve the peace project that the EU is. And that's what citizens at this moment throughout the Union are very much concerned, that indeed we risk destroying the EU with our incapacity to get out of the crisis. I would like to say that I'm happen to be the standing rapporteur of the European Parliament for Libya. I go there often. I don't share the positive assessment that has been said here about Libya. Not that there are not potential opportunities, wish on the Libyan authorities' side for us to get more involved, but because we have been pretty shy, and I could go on and along on that. I just would like to say that EU coordination is the vital thing, so that our member states don't go back to the business as usual in the times of Gaddafi, to go about oil and arms on their own. It's European coordination that is vital there. Syria, it's very different from Libya. In Libya, we had a single authority or an entity representing the forces of the revolution, different from Syria. That's why I don't think it's a good idea to arm the parties. It's very dangerous. Mali, sorry to say, the EU is not there. France is there. The EU is not there. There's no point for any self-congratulatory mode on Mali. It's quite a shame that we're not there together with France. And since, actually, for a long time, since 2011, we have a security strategy for the Sahel, which foresaw a EU security sector reform, which is still not there, despite the French intervention. And let me ask you then, Minister, a crucial thing for CSDP missions like the one that is being deployed in Mali to actually work and be more, get more contributions of troops is to have common funding for CSDP. And we don't have that common funding except for the startup. And this is what prevents several member states who cannot contribute financially to, but could possibly contribute in troops from not doing it. Finally, last time we met in Cyprus, we heard Mr. Bernardino Leon from the Office of the High Representative to ask us to do something on helping asset recovery for the Arab Spring countries. This links to the question raised by Ms. O'Sullivan. What are we doing indeed to help governance in the countries we deal with? Asset recovery is a major priority.
Thank you very much indeed. Our next speaker is from the House of Representatives in Malta, and is Ms. Karuna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, the EU is a Nobel Prize winner for peacekeeping. However, more than ever, it needs to look closely at its own policies for vulnerable people, especially children, women and disabled. The EU should radically reform Dublin II to take into account equitable burden sharing among member states with genuinely common asylum standards and reception procedures. The EU should also provide countries at the EU borders, such as Malta, more assistance to improve their capacity to protect and assist refugees. A reputation as a peacemaker carries with it an obligation to protect victims of war, and refugees from many countries go to great lengths to find safety in the EU, and therefore the same EU must provide decent sanctuary for these people. Please allow me to reiterate what Baroness Ashton expressed yesterday. She said that the effectiveness of Europe is judged by its effects on neighbouring countries, and also allow me to add, by its effects on the improvement of the quality of life and respect for fundamental human rights. My question is related to illegal immigration. It was originally intended to Baroness Ashton, but there was no time yesterday, so I'm putting it forward today. As you may well be aware, illegal immigration is a consequence of conflict, which is affecting Malta in particular, and therefore my question to you is this. What are the future plans and initiatives from the EU side to effectively tackle illegal immigration and equitable burden sharing? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our final speaker in this lot is Ms. Sabais from the Swedish Parliament.
Thank you. When I think of conflict prevention, I really don't believe, or I really don't think it's just about to reduce the conflicts that already exists. I think that we have to talk very much more about the cooperation. For example, poverty reduction, we have to talk about to reduce the risks for the consequences of climate change. We have to talk about food security, we have to talk about human rights and democracy, and everything that the European Union can do in this regard. But as we are now talking anyway about conflicts, I would like to raise some conflicts where I think that the European Union could play a very significant role. We have already heard about the situation in Israel and Palestine, but we haven't heard anything, we haven't spoken about the situation in Morocco and Western Sahara, where we also have a country who is occupying another territory, and where the European Union could play a very significant role if we really take a stand for democracy and human rights and the people's right of self-determination. I think that we can also play a very significant role now in these days when we talk about the Kurdish issue. We had the ceasefire from Öcalan the other day. We could do very much more from Europe, so I would like to hear what are Europe or the European Union doing in this regard. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Taoiseach, over to you.
Well, first of all, the issue raised by Ana Gomez, I would agree that, you know, I don't think anybody should engage in self-congratulation over the winning of the Nobel Peace Prize, but I think it did serve as, I think, a useful reminder that the European Union is not just a currency or an economy. And looking at the last number of years, I think we'd all be forgiven that that's what the European Union. It did remind us that the European Union is about more than just economics and banking and budgets and all of those issues that have preoccupied our thinking over that period of time. And I suppose, I think, probably motivates us to do more in the promoting of the values of the shared values of the European Union, particularly in relation to the prevention of conflict and the promotion of peace. I hope I didn't present an over rosy picture of the situation in Libya. It certainly wasn't my intention to do that. And I do agree that the active EU coordination in Libya and with Libya is vital. There are big challenges, particularly on the security front. But the European Union is making a contribution, for example, in relation to the new border mission, for example, which has been agreed. On the issue of Syria, as I've said earlier, I think that what we have to continue to do is to work for the political settlement in Syria, support Dr. Brahimi, continue to work for a robust United Nations position on it. I think if we were to go down the route of enabling arms to be provided, I think it would have an undermining effect on that political strategy. I don't agree that the European Union is not present in Mali. Clearly, the European Union is there in the form of the training mission. Ireland, for example, is participating in that. I've seen. I was in Uganda and Kenya and Somalia, indeed, during the summer, and I've seen the work that the training mission has done for Somalia. Hugely important work which it is doing, working with Somalian forces, and indeed has made a very, very big contribution to it, and I think it has potential to do the same in Mali. Common funding for CSDP missions may indeed be desirable, but wearing my hat as chairperson capacity of our presidency of the General Affairs Council, I'm only too well aware of the difficulty that there is in agreeing a European Union budget. The MFF, which has been on which the member states through the European Council have reached a position which clearly is now the subject of discussion with the European Parliament is unfinished business, and I think we have to, you have to consider that in the context of those difficulties. On the issue which was raised by Ms. Caruana from Malta on the illegal immigration issue, I'm not in a position to give a detailed reply on behalf of the High Representative, but I do understand that work is being done in the relevant councils and working groups on the issue of illegal immigration, and it has also been something that has been the subject of some discussion at the Foreign Affairs Council. Ms. Sabelos, in relation to conflict prevention, again, I agree that we do need to embrace issues like climate change, poverty, hunger, the causes of conflict, really. One of the initiatives which we are undertaking as part of our presidency is a conference which will be held here next month, which we're co-hosting with the Mary Robinson Foundation, which is on the issue of climate justice, which will bring together the themes of climate change, hunger, nutrition, poverty, and the importance of those issues in addressing conflict prevention. On the Kurdish issue, I'm very conscious of the political and human rights issues which are associated with the plight of the Kurds. That must not be lost sight of in dealing with the appalling conflict in Syria and the instability in the region. I know it remains high on the European Union's radar, and it features in all of our dialogues with governments in the region.
Okay, Taoiseach, thank you very much indeed. We'll move to our next slot, and again, we have a lot of speakers that want to get in here, so maybe if I could ask the delegates to keep their remarks brief, it might help the proceedings. Okay, our next speaker is from the Iceland Parliament. We want to welcome our colleagues from Iceland here this morning, and it's Mr. Sigurðsson.
Thank you, and Honourable Minister and dear colleagues. I'd like to comment on the situation in Palestine and how we can support the Palestinians and increase pressure on the Israeli government to halt the policy of illegal settlements in the occupied areas and start real negotiations on a two-state solution. The State of Palestine was proclaimed 25 years ago, and despite the fact that the Palestinians do not have a UN membership, the state is already recognized by more than 130 countries, including 8 EU countries. Although these recognitions were to some extent granted in the geopolitical context of the 80s, I'm confident that if the remaining member states and observers of this conference recognize Palestine, that would be a forceful act of showing our support for Palestinian statehood and that we are dead serious in our demand for a two-state solution. I would also like to add that Iceland took the step of recognizing Palestine in 2011 within the pre-1967 borders. And this we did in the same spirit as we were in the lead in recognizing the regained independence of the Baltic states. We simply believe that it is important to show our solidarity by direct and tangible support. So I would like to hear how the Minister views the prospect of a consensus within the EU on recognizing the state of Palestine, and if he does agree with me that it is a prerequisite or might be a prerequisite for the two-state solution that Palestine meet Israel on an equal footing with the recognition of the international community as an independent and sovereign state, which I believe is their legitimate right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And now we have from the United Kingdom House of Commons, Sir Malcolm Bruce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wonder if I could address something that Mr. Gilmer didn't raise, which is the role of official development assistance in conflict prevention. I think colleagues may know that in the British budget last week, our Chancellor of the Exchequer announced that this year the United Kingdom will deliver 0.7% of GNI in official development assistance, the first G20 country to do so. And that's only been achieved because we have strong cross-party consensus, because at a time of recession, it's obviously not very popular in all quarters to be making that commitment, but we have done so. And we are focusing on countries emerging from conflict and trying to ensure that official development assistance helps them to stay out of conflict and to build a more stable, prosperous society, and one that perhaps is less prone to appeals to terrorism or other forms of destabilizing activity, which obviously come back to us here in Europe. And in particular, apart from Africa, which obviously Mr. Gilmore quite rightly mentioned the EU's role in Somalia, the Horn of Africa and Mali, all close to our shores, but he didn't mention, for example, Pakistan and Afghanistan, which are very real commitments, which are both of them facing real critical futures. And if things go badly in either or both of those countries, there are serious implications for the whole of the world, not least because Pakistan is a nuclear power, and indeed for the EU. So I would be interested to know how proactive the EU is, as opposed to individual member states, in trying to engage in these fragile countries which are either in conflict, emerging from conflict, or threatened with falling back into conflict, and particularly the role, not exclusively, but of official development assistance, and indeed the extent to which other countries could be encouraged to fulfil their obligations in the way that the United Kingdom has done.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Bruce. And our final speaker here is from the House of the Oireachtas here in the Irish Parliament. That's Mr. Bernard Durkin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I wish to congratulate the Taoiseach for his response to the calls for increased armaments and munitions in the Syrian conflict. It's impossible to understand how increased supply of arms and ammunition is likely to contribute in any way to a peace process. But conversely, can I ask him whether or not sufficient pressure has been brought upon the Arab countries, and not necessarily their immediate neighbours, to try to influence a more better disposition towards making peace? And to what extent has Russia and China been involved in that particular debate, and has the European Union put sufficient pressure on them? Similarly, in relation to another particular question, can I ask the Taoiseach whether, given that the European Union is highly regarded as an aid donor worldwide and makes a huge contribution above and beyond all others in that regard, to what extent is the European Union regarded as an influential peacemaker worldwide? Because I would contend that it is not as highly regarded as a peacemaker or peace creator or the environment for peace as it is an aid donor, and how can that situation be improved?
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Durkin. Over to you, Taoiseach.
Firstly, the observations by Mr. Sigurdsson of Iceland on the issue of Palestine. I want to say, first of all, that I very much agree that the European Union, and indeed I think others, do need to step up pressure on Israel in relation to engagement on the Palestinian issue. We now have a new government in Israel. There is an opportunity now for serious engagement to find a lasting settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think that opportunity should be taken. As far as the European Union's position on settlements is concerned, the Foreign Affairs Council conclusions last May, and indeed in December, were very strong, very clear in relation to the settlements issue, that there must be a halt to settlements, and that the continued settlements will make the two-state solution virtually impossible. I think it's important that we have an early review of the conclusions that were reached last May, and I hope that we will have that review at a meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council in the not too distant future. There are differing views, of course, on the issue of the status of the Palestinian state. I think that was shown in the vote at the United Nations last autumn. There was an attempt made in the run-in to that vote at the United Nations to get a common European Union position, but it wasn't possible to do so for the very clear reason that some states are very much in favour of supporting UN membership, Palestinian membership of the United Nations. Some are opposed to it, and some would rather that we not take a position in the interest of having a common position. I think what is probably more important is the contribution that the European Union can make to what is actually happening on the ground, and to encouraging engagement and a settlement. On the issues raised by Sir Malcolm Bruce, first of all, let me say that I want to congratulate the United Kingdom on reaching the 0.7% target. I think that is a very strong and a very clear and a position of leadership that is taken by the UK on this issue. In respect of our own contribution here as a country, I want to say that we're proud of the fact that although we've had very serious economic difficulties, that we've been able to maintain our level of development aid even in difficult circumstances. I do think that development aid does have an enormous contribution to make to conflict prevention. I think it has an enormous contribution to make to the improvement of good governance, apart altogether from the contribution that it very obviously makes in addressing issues of hunger and poverty and of economic development. And on the issue of economic development, I think it has a very big contribution to make in moving from a situation of countries who are dependent on aid to countries who are trading, in many cases, with the donor countries that have assisted them in the past. The European Union, I think, has a very proud record on this, and I think it is one of the strengths of the European Union in its overall foreign policy position and in its influence in the world. Over 50% of the development aid in the world comes from the European Union and its member states. And I think it is something that we should be proud of in the European Union, and I also think it is a lever that the European Union can successfully use in its influence in the world and in the contribution that we make to world affairs. I agree that there are obviously serious implications rising from developments in Pakistan and Afghanistan. The European Union is contributing to development assistance in these countries. I don't have figures for it, but Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the strategy for Afghanistan and Pakistan is a growing priority for the European Union. The issues raised by Bernard Durkan, I do agree that it is very important to get both Russia and China into a supportive position on Syria at the United Nations. There has been a lot of European Union effort devoted to that. It's been very much top of the agenda, both in the discussions that are taking place between the EU and Russia and China, and also between individual member states and Russia and China. I think that the approach needs to be to support what Dr. Brahimi is attempting to do, to support building an outcome or a solution based on the Geneva communique. And finally, the point that you made, Deputy Durkan, about Europe. Europe has big potential as a peacemaker and as a force for good, and I think we need to build much more on that.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Taoiseach. Again, we'll move to our next slot, and we have 3 more speakers here. From the Slovenian National Council, we have Mr. Golub.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Wir folgen ausgezeichnete Ausführungen von Herrn.
We've listened to the excellent statements made by Mr. Breen and Mr. Gilmer and colleagues. Our opinion is that an important task for peace development in Europe, Africa, Libya, Somalia, Palestinian, etc., Pakistan, Afghanistan, etc., has also been mentioned as well. So this is an important challenge. The challenge is increasing, and a challenge is to create new bridges to resolve issues like unemployment and show those huge masses of unemployed people a way forward. A famed philosopher has said, civis pacem civilibum. I think that we need to also look at demographics and how the world population has increased. We now have a population of 7 billion coming up on. Now, throughout the world, we need to find a common solution in what has become a closed system, as it were. That is an important political, social, and, in fact, most importantly, philosophical issue. And we need innovative thinking. I'd refer you to Spinoza, for example. His thinking was crucial to the beginnings of socialism. So the question is, do we want the future to be better for coming generations? Europe has, or does Europe have an important role to play here? Ministers, I would remind you that Europe perhaps has many important roles to play. And do we use the carrot or the stick? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. From the House of Lords in the United Kingdom, we have Lord Foulkes.
Thank you, Chair, and can I also thank Eamon Gilmore, not just for his excellent speech, but also for the very warm welcome that we have had from the Irish Parliament and the Irish Government, and also for the excellent way that Ireland is carrying out its presidency. And can I return to the question of Syria, which a number of delegates have already touched on, because I think it is one of the immediate urgent problems facing us, and I think it also represents the dilemma of the European Union in terms of what we can do effectively in conflict prevention. I share Eamon Gilmore's reservations about arming the moderate forces, not just because some of the arms might get into the wrong hands, but because I think it will inevitably lead to escalation and possible intervention, and we know the problems that that creates. But there is a pressure to do something, and because of the refugees as well as the people who are being killed within Syria. And Eamon Gilmore said that the position of the European Union is for a political solution and the removal of Assad. Well, how do you remove Assad unless you arm the rebels or carry out some intervention? And over the next few weeks, indeed at the next Foreign Affairs Council, I expect that there will be one or two representatives of one or two governments urging that action. How is Eamon Gilmore going to react to that? What alternative will you propose? And how do you think it's going to go at the upcoming meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council?
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And our final speaker in this slot is from the Chamber of Deputies in Italy, and it's Ms. Bergamini.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Chairman.
Ministro,
Minister, in your introductory comments, you touched upon European Union's excellent record when it comes to safeguarding and promoting peace, stability, and respect for human rights. Now, this is certainly true. However, I'd like now to talk about the countries of the Arab Spring. Now, apart, of course, for the peculiarity of each of these countries, we are now nonetheless really observing major difficulties in constructing democratic transition processes which really are truly participatory. In other words, civil society getting properly involved. Now, I think the European Union has done an excellent job and has coordinated and worked with various international bodies, Council of Europe, for example, and so on, when it comes to long-term investments through the intercultural dialogue. In fact, you yourself touched upon the importance of the role of women, the importance of the role of young people. Okay. Now, we need to continue working on that particular side of things, while, of course, keeping in mind that for the member states of the European Union, we're talking here about significant investment in a period of recession, precisely in a moment when our budgets require investments which can be measured and can bear fruit in the short term. Baroness Ashton now should now come to these countries with an economics platform, because we need to tackle issues such as youth unemployment, which is a crucial issue, of course, which of course unites all these countries. But that's not just the only issue, of course. So my question for you is the following. This need to work on the intercultural dialogue while at the same time coming forward with economic solutions, might that not lead to an effect which would beef up the bilateral side of things, beef up our bilateral relationships with these countries at the cost of the multilateral side of things? And if that happens, how do you think the European Union should behave?
Thank you very much indeed, Taoiseach. 3 sets of questions there.
Well, I think, first of all, the question raised by Mr. Golub of Slovenia, I think in many ways, goes to the heart of the way in which foreign policy needs to be conducted in the modern world. I'm reminded of something that Secretary of State John Kerry said recently, a speech that he made on foreign policy following his appointment as Secretary of State, made the point that there is no longer anything foreign about foreign policy. And I think that that is very true. If you look at the degree to which we live now in a globalized world, if you look at the relationship between issues like demographics, energy, climate, technology, communication, foreign policy is no longer foreign. Foreign policy is about ensuring that we work together collectively, multilaterally, to ensure that the world is a better place, and that in a world where populations are growing and demand for food is growing and demand for services and health services, and we're seeing huge growth in urbanization. Look at Africa, for example. All of the challenges that poses. Issues around economics, employment, the future that people want to see, this very strong sense of aspiration that populations in countries which, 20 years ago, because of communication reasons and so on, maybe the same degree of aspiration wasn't there. We're living very much in a new world, and I think we have to move very quickly to catch up with that. And yes, we do need, I think, a lot of new thinking, a lot of innovative thinking about the way in which foreign policy is conducted. It is no longer something that is about one country and another country. It is now much more, I think, a collective endeavour, and we're seeing some of that, I think, in the European Union, the development of the common foreign policy, the emergence, 2 years old now, the External Action Service, and the work that the Foreign Affairs Council is doing. But it is still very much, I think, a work in progress. On the issues raised by Lord Foulkes about Syria, there is no, I don't think that anybody has a simple, succinct answer about what to do about Syria. I mean, we are looking here at an enormous tragedy. What we do know is that there are 70,000 people already killed. It's probably higher than that, but 70,000 is the conservative estimate of the number of people who have been killed in Syria. We're looking at 1 million people who have been driven out of the country into refugee camps in Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey, living in really appalling conditions. About 2 million people who've been displaced from their homes. We're looking at a situation where there's a shortage of basic necessities, bread, medical supplies. This is an enormous tragedy that is unfolding before us. And I think the question of what to do about it is a very fundamental question, and there isn't an easy answer to it. The approach that the international community has taken to date is to unite, and albeit with the failure of the UN to agree, the Security Council to agree a resolution, but to unite around the approach being taken by Dr. Brahimi to try and make progress on the Geneva communique, to try and win support, to get Russia on board for that, to get China on board for it, and to achieve a peaceful transition in Syria and to rebuild that society. The argument is, of course, that it's not working. That, you know, I mean, yes, we have all of this diplomatic effort and all of this political effort, but the slaughter continues. And the argument that is being made, and I understand the argument that is being made, is that if you allow arms to be delivered to the moderate forces, the argument being that some of the more extremist elements in the country have access to arms anyway. Assad has access to arms, so let's make arms available to the moderate forces, and that will change the situation on the ground, that a different calculation will then be made both by Assad and by some of the people and countries supporting him, and that will lead to a political solution. Well, the big problem with that argument is that what may happen on the ground may not be quite as neat as that. Because what may happen on the ground is that if more arms get into the situation, then those Assad, some of the more extremist elements may decide to equip themselves with even more arms. So you end up with a proliferation of arms in a country that is already disintegrating into a civil war situation. And that has huge implications for the country itself, for the people in the country, for further slaughter, for further suffering in the country, but it has also huge implications for a region that is already under pressure for a variety of other reasons. So it seems to me that, you know, frustrating and all as it is, that we must consolidate our effort around the political and the diplomatic effort. I think we have to renew and increase our effort to get Russia on board, to get them to take a more positive position in relation to what they are doing. That, I think, is, and you asked, you know, what is my alternative to arming the moderate? That is the alternative. I'm not arguing that it is one that is producing results anytime soon. But I think we need to be very, very cautious about going down a route which increases the amount of weaponry that is available in Syria and the further militarization of the situation because of where it may go, not just for Syria itself, but the wider implications for a region which is already under pressure. On the issues raised by Ms. Bergamini, we are seeing, we are seeing difficulties in the construction of democratic societies arising from the Arab Spring, and I think take the countries who are gathered here in this room. In virtually every one of our countries, there were difficulties in the establishment, the taking root of democracy and the building of democracy. We've all taken different routes through it. This country had a bloody civil war after our independence struggle, and we also had a continuing conflict in Northern Ireland until very recent times. Different countries have had different difficulties in establishing and rooting down democracy. So I don't think it should be entirely surprising that just because a regime is pulled down in an Arab country that we're going to see coming into effect immediately and perfectly and with all of the institutions perfectly in place, democratic institutions overnight. And the European Union is going to have to help and work with countries in order to bring about that democratic society building, and obviously work with other organisations like the Council of Europe in doing that as well. Both the economic and the intercultural dialogue are obviously a key part of that. I think that particular emphasis does need to be placed on the economic because we do know, for example, the economic challenges that the countries in the Arab Spring are facing, difficulties in Egypt, for example, and therefore I think that there is an assistance and a help that the European Union can give to the countries of the Arab Spring in that regard.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Taoiseach. Now we have about 12 speakers that wish to contribute here and our time is running out, so could I ask the remaining speakers to be brief and just confine themselves to one question, and if they could less than a minute if at all possible. I want to be trying to be as inclusive as at all possible. Our next speaker here is Ms. Lusing from the European Parliament.
Ja, vielen Dank. Herr Minister, Sie sprachen
Thank you very much.
Minister,
you talked about diplomatic conflict prevention and the diplomatic path towards conflict resolution. Now, I've carefully read the agenda and various documentation, and in a number of EU reports, there are a few red lines, as it were, running through them in favour of beefed up diplomatic policy, including some military aspects as well. Obviously, there is this negative impact of the budget and austerity and the impact that that has on the member states. But this seems like a way to somehow try and justify the military defense industry in Europe. Now, I only have figures from Germany, but in June 2010, a decision was taken that the overall budget for 2014 would be down 81 billion euros. Originally, there was 8.3 billion contribution, and that means that the defense budget should have been reduced by 27 million. But that brings us back to the level in 2006. But despite that, if you look at the financial plans for 2011, for 2014, the defense budget is still up. So if I look at the figures for my budget, for my country, there can be no talk of savings and scaling back on defence spending. And this is the kind of thing that is not understandable to the Member States. And my group is of the view that it would be better that money would be put into resolving the issues that gave rise to conflicts rather than dealing with the problems. Prevention being better than cure.
Okay, our next speaker is from the Belgium Senate, and it's Mr. Van Loo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Gilmore. I will be short. As you know, dear colleagues, this weekend our Foreign Affairs Minister did not have taken a decision on the fate of the EU's weapons embargo against Syria. I can only hope in the future, at the end of May, the beginning of June, that the EU is able to speak with one voice. I, and I'm sure many of my colleagues agree, am very wary of lifting the embargo. As been said, it's impossible to guarantee that these heavy weapons will arrive at the right destination. Everyone knows that lifting the embargo is not without any risks for the security in the region and for our own security. I know most of us, if not all, have ruled out the option of a political solution to the civil war in Syria, to those countries who are still delivering weapons to the regime of Assad and at the same time vetoing any decision in the UN Security Council. We should react with one common voice. A Europe based on common values such as democracy, the rule of law and respect for human rights should openly express its condemnation over the refusal to those countries, permanent members of the Security Council, who have made it impossible to work on a solution for Syria. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And our final speaker in this lot is Mr. Dimas from the Greek Parliament.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will be very brief. The issue of Syria has been already raised many times. I want to add, though, another perspective. We all heard yesterday Baroness Ashton stating that Europe will be judged by its effectiveness in its own neighborhood. Coming from Greece, the southeastern Mediterranean is my neighborhood and is one of Europe's neighborhoods as well. I would like to ask the Nest how the EU can fortify EU borders in southeastern Europe due to the increased immigration movements witnessed currently in our neighborhood. I would like to inform you that according to the OECD, official documents show an increase of 515.8% in the arrest of Syrians in the Greek-Turkish borders when comparing to the previous year, 2011. As the country that is called to deal first with the increased immigration movement towards the EU, Greece is making a great effort to tackle the issue in a just and effective way. My question is very specific. Peace and stability in the area is obviously our final goal. In the meantime, though, we have to be effective in our own neighborhood as well. How can we increase our effectiveness in the patrol of the EU borders, and what can the EU do in order to pursue this goal? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dimas. Taoiseach.
Ms. Lussing, first of all, I think I don't propose to be drawn into a discussion on the detail of the German defence budget and its relative place in the overall budgetary situation. But I do agree that we should try to tackle the factors which give rise to conflict. And certainly my own preference is that our focus should be on prevention and addressing the economic, the social, the demographic, the many other factors which give rise to conflict in the first place. And I would hope that the approach that Europe is taking to conflict prevention does emphasise the prevention side and working in that direction. Mr. Van Loo, Well, I think what you've said, I think, largely reflects the point of view that I previously that I've expressed a number of times now during our discussion here on Syria. This is not an easy. It's not an easy question. There are decisions that will have to be taken by the Foreign Affairs Council between now and the 1st of June, when the sanctions come up for renewal. I expect that there will be a vigorous discussion and a vigorous debate on the options that are available. Mr. Dimas, yes, I do agree that we do need to see an increased EU effectiveness in patrolling of EU borders, particularly indeed in the southeastern borders of the European Union, and southern borders, where we've seen, arising from the Arab Spring and more recently arising from the conflict in Syria, a considerable amount of pressure in terms of immigration. The details of how we work through those controls, I think, is something that will obviously have to be worked through by Justice and Home Affairs ministers, but I think that there is work that does need to be done on that dimension, and I think it is part of European solidarity that we should do so, and that we should bear in mind the pressures that countries such as Greece, and Malta, and Cyprus, and Italy have been under as a result of what has been happening both in the Arab world and, as I said, more recently in Syria.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Tánaiste. Unfortunately, I have to finish this session at 11 o'clock, so we're now going on to our final slot. And again, if I could ask the speakers to be brief. And our next question comes from Mr. Bill Cash from the House of Commons in the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Well, first of all, thank you, Ireland, for all this. I prefer the word peace broker to peacemaker. I'm afraid that the word peacemaker implies a coherence and credibility that I don't think the European Union possesses in this field. I think it's become over-ambitious. And the fact is that there are world problems involved in all the matters we've discussed today. I mean, just to take Syria, for example, and the Middle East. The reality is that there are influences at work there, which include, obviously, Israel as well as the United States. There is China involved in Africa, the whole question of the failure of Afghanistan, the Islamic question. I believe very strongly that we need cooperation, not coordination. The idea that the European Union can act as a greater force than it has the capacity to deliver is more likely to create instability and failed expectations. And I welcome the idea of engagement, but I would say peace-broking rather than peacemaking. Peacemaking carries very serious connotations. There is not the capacity to deliver.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. From the Lithuanian Parliament, Mr. Azaboulis.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for standing hospitality and very good organization. I also want to congratulate you, Eamon, with the first half of a very successful Irish presidency. Now a question. EU-Russia's post-PCA negotiations goes not very well. Someone could say that in some areas they are even freezed. That's why some EU countries claims that visa-free regime could appease Russia and could give a new breath for post-PCA negotiations. My question is, what do you think? How Russia is ready for visa-free regime, having in mind very tense situation in Central Asia and Caucasus? And of course, remembering that Ireland, your country, is easy and attractive foreign tourist destination, as it's written here in the lobby. Thank you.
Okay, and our final speaker here on this slot this morning, and the final speaker for this session is Mr. Michael Gawler from the European Parliament.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Minister.
Thank you, Minister. I expressly welcome that you haven't confined yourself to the topic of conflict prevention, that you also looked at conflict resolution and so forth. We need capacities and we face common challenges. First of all, the US basically is telling us to take care of affairs in our own back garden. And secondly, we see that the issues are coming closer to home. Thirdly, budgetary restrictions. My question is, since we are talking about the overall 2